In the winter of 1977, André Rieu stood in a crumbling conservatory hallway in Maastricht, violin tucked under his arm, watching the other students laugh easily with one another. He was 27 years old, already technically brilliant, already considered one of the most promising young musicians in the Netherlands. The concert halls called him gifted. The professors called him exceptional. But inside that hallway, behind that polished exterior, André Rieu felt something he had never been able to outrun, the suffocating, bone-deep certainty that he did not belong. Not here. Not anywhere that required him to be serious, rigid, and perfectly contained inside someone else's idea of what music should be. His dream was not to play Edelweiss or Blue Danube the way they were written. His dream was to make them breathe differently. There is an irony in André Rieu's story that hurts too much to be coincidence. The child who grew up drowning in classical music but felt invisible inside it, watching the world exclude itself from the very thing he loved most. The young man who discovered that people did not just want to hear music, they wanted to be rescued by it, to waltz through life with joy instead of sitting in silent reverence. The global phenomenon who built an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars on the radical, nearly laughable idea that joy was a legitimate art form, that a man could play Conquest of Paradise and make strangers cry in stadiums instead of concert halls. All of that, so that the entire classical music establishment could spend decades telling him his joy was too loud, too common, too embarrassingly human to deserve a stage. All of that so that decades later, young violinists like Amira Willekagen would discover him and understand that there was another way to live inside music. How does a boy raised inside the cathedral of serious music become the man who tears the cathedral walls down so everyone can dance inside? What hides beneath the silver hair, the theatrical bow, the perpetual waltz that transforms every stage into La Vie en Rose? What happens when the very world that shaped you decides you are an embarrassment to everything it taught you to love? How does a musician find redemption when the path to redemption means abandoning everything his father taught him to respect? To understand all of that, we need to go back to the beginning, to Maastricht, to 1949, and to a boy who learned in the most bewildering way possible that music could either be a locked door or an open window, and that choosing between them would cost him everything he thought mattered. André Marie Nicolas Rieu was born on January 1st, 1949 in Maastricht, a small, quietly beautiful city in the southern tip of the Netherlands, where Belgium and Germany press against its borders like curious neighbors. It is a city of old bridges, amberlight, and cobblestone squares where history feels less like a lesson and more like something you accidentally inhale. The streets are narrow and unrushed. The people carry themselves with the particular dignity of a place that has survived empires and wars and learned not to rush toward anything. His father, Joe Rieu, was the conductor of the Maastricht Orchestra, a man of deep musical convictions and a kind of quiet emotional distance that gets passed down through families like a recessive gene affecting generations before anyone understands what it is. His mother, Jetty, was warm but perpetually managing the complex gravity of a household organized entirely around art and expectation, where dinner conversations about Brahms and Beethoven were as common as salt at the table. André was the fifth of 6 children. The house was never silent and rarely still. There were instruments in every room and concerts every weekend, and a kind of musical intensity that other families reserved for religious belief. There was no luxury in the traditional sense, no inherited wealth or aristocratic lineage. But there was something heavier than luxury, the weight of a father whose approval came wrapped in musical standards that a child could spend a lifetime chasing and never quite reaching. The violin arrived in André's hands at age 5, and with it came a message, unspoken but absolute, that this was how you communicated love in this family. Not through words, through technical perfection, through the ability to disappear inside someone else's composition and make it sound inevitable. His father, Joe, was not cruel in the way cruelty announces itself with volume. He was precise in the way that precision can become its own form of distance. The music that filled their home was always serious, always structured, always demanding a kind of emotional suppression that comes naturally to no child, but particularly unnaturally to a boy who felt the world the way André did. Every note André played was an attempt to be seen. Every technical correction his father offered was proof that being seen and being accepted were two entirely different experiences. The Maastricht Orchestra performed the repertoire with reverence and exactness, and young André watched his father conduct with a kind of monastic devotion, and he understood that this was what music was supposed to be: sacred, untouchable, above the impulses of ordinary people who simply wanted to feel good. At school, André existed in an unusual purgatory that would haunt him for decades. He was not the outcast in the traditional sense, not bullied in corridors or mocked with cruel nicknames. His wound was subtler and therefore harder to name, the kind of wound that leaves no visible scars but reorganizes a person's entire interior architecture. He felt genuinely, persistently out of place inside the classical tradition that everyone assumed was his natural home. The music he was trained to perform demanded emotional suppression, demanded that the musician become invisible in service of the score, that technique should triumph over the impulse to move people's bodies and hearts simultaneously. But André felt too much. He noticed the elderly woman in the third row whose eyes filled with tears during a Strauss melody, not the famous ones, but the ones nobody performed anymore. He watched children fidget in concert halls and imagined them somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the music chased them rather than excluded them. Years later, after he had become the most commercially successful classical musician in history, after he had performed at the Olympic Games and sold out stadiums and played Bolero in the Rose and Bésame Mucho to audiences that numbered in the millions, he would confess, with a voice carrying the particular texture of old unsettled things, "I always felt that classical music had built a wall around itself, and I was being asked to help maintain that wall. But I kept looking at the people on the other side of it, and I thought, they deserve this too. The woman working double shifts deserves to waltz. The child in the village deserves to hear Romeo and Juliet played with joy instead of performed with obligation." At 18, André was enrolled at the Royal Conservatory in Brussels, and later at the Conservatory in Liege, following the only map available to someone of his training and background. He was technically exceptional. His bow control was precise to the millimeter. His intonation was crystalline. He graduated with honors that meant something in the rarefied world of classical music, where technical mastery was currency and emotional restraint was virtue. But somewhere in those conservatory years, a quiet, persistent rebellion was forming inside him, not loud enough yet to be called a decision, but present enough to be felt, the way you feel a storm in your knees before you see it in the sky. He would spend the next decade trying to live inside the world his father had handed him, performing in orchestras, teaching at conservatories, doing exactly what a man of his talent was supposed to do. And slowly, painfully, discovering that a man cannot perform someone else's definition of music forever without eventually, irrevocably, losing the sound of his own voice. The turning point arrived on a night in 1978 that André would never forget. He was conducting a small orchestra in Maastricht, the same city where his father had built his legacy, the same stages where Joe Rieu had earned respectful silence and genuine admiration. André stood before the musicians with his baton, preparing to conduct a traditional classical concert when something shifted inside him, a kind of spiritual vertigo. He looked out at the empty seats, the handful of elderly subscribers who attended these performances out of habit rather than hunger, and he felt a despair so complete it was almost clarifying. This was not music. This was a museum. This was people preserving something instead of living it. And he understood in that moment, with the sudden clarity of an epiphany, that he had two choices: continue to conduct respectfully toward an audience that was slowly disappearing, or do something so radical, so fundamentally opposed to everything his father represented, that it would either destroy him or save him. entirely. André went home that night and sat alone in a room with his violin for hours. And when he emerged, something had broken open inside him. Not violently, but inevitably, the way ice breaks in spring. He decided to create something that the classical world had deemed impossible, an orchestra that would perform music with joy, not frivolously, not with disrespect for the composers, but with the radical understanding that Strauss wrote waltzes because he wanted people to dance, not sit in judgment. That the second waltz and the waltz goes on were not sacred objects to be preserved in amber, but living, breathing invitations to experience beauty in motion. He would take the classics, the sacred repertoire that his father had devoted his life to, and he would make them accessible to people who had never been invited into concert halls. He would play them with passion. He would surround them with theatrical staging. He would make people feel rather than think. In 1978, at 29 years old, André founded the Johann Strauss Orchestra. It was not initially celebrated. The classical establishment looked at what he was doing and saw betrayal. Here was a conservatory-trained violinist, someone who could have had a respectable career in serious music, instead choosing to dress up, to entertain, to make classical music into something that resembled show business more than art. The reviews were brutal. One prominent critic wrote, "Rieu mistakes popularity for accomplishment. He is making a mockery of everything the classical tradition represents." His father, Joe Rieu, now in his 70s, watched his son's transformation with a pain that was never explicitly spoken but always present, like static electricity in a room. This was not what he had trained André to become. This was not the legacy he had intended to pass down. But André had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would rather be authentic and rejected than respectable and hollow. The Johann Strauss Orchestra began performing in theaters instead of concert halls. André added elaborate stage sets, theatrical lighting, sometimes dancers. He began playing not just Strauss, but arrangements of contemporary music transformed into waltzes. He played La Paloma with such tenderness that people wept. He played Il Silenzio, the Italian instrumental piece about the silence of war, and made it into an anthem for peace that transcended language. He played Macarena and somehow made it feel classical and contemporary simultaneously. The audiences grew, initially through word of mouth, then through word of experience. The turning point from local curiosity to genuine phenomenon came in the early 1980s when André began recording his performances. The first albums were released on smaller labels with modest expectations. But something extraordinary happened when people heard these recordings in their homes, in their cars, in their ordinary lives. The music did not demand to be taken seriously. It invited you to remember why you had loved music in the first place. A woman who had not attended a concert in 30 years heard André play Blue Danube and felt something shift in her chest. A man whose wife was dying of cancer played The Rose on repeat and found that it gave him permission to cry. Families gathered around radios and televisions to watch André conduct, and they saw not a man performing music, but a man clearly, unmistakably in love with the act of making people feel something together. By the late 1980s, André Rieu had become a phenomenon in Europe that most of America had never heard of. The way important things often happen quietly in one part of the world before they suddenly explode everywhere else. He was playing to increasingly larger audiences, but the critical establishment still largely dismissed him. He was too popular to be taken seriously. He was too theatrical to be considered a real musician. He was building something that defied the categories that serious music had established for itself. And then, in a moment that would change everything, a young talent discovered his work, and everything began to accelerate toward the future he had always believed in. In 2008, a young Dutch girl named Amira Willekhagen was watching André Rieu on television when something inside her recognized something inside him. She was 9 years old, quiet from a modest background, and she possessed a gift that made her feel simultaneously blessed and utterly alone. She could sing with a voice that carried maturity beyond her years, a voice that seemed to contain more history and emotion than a child should be able to access. But like André decades before her, she felt invisible inside the traditional structures that were supposed to celebrate her talent. She watched André conduct, watched him make thousands of people rise to their feet, watched him transform classical music into something that belonged to everyone, and she understood something fundamental. There was another way. There was a way to honor the tradition while breaking its walls down. André Rieu and Amira Willekagen would eventually perform together, and in that moment, the circle would close. The man who had been rejected by the establishment for making music accessible would give permission to the next generation to do the same thing. But before that redemption, before that vindication, André Rieu had to survive something far more devastating than critical dismissal. He had to survive success itself and the particular brutality that comes when the world finally decides you were right all along, but only after you have paid prices that money cannot measure. By the 1990s, André Rieu had become a commercial juggernaut. His albums sold in the millions. His concerts filled arenas. He was performing Conquest of Paradise and Love in Venice and Voila, and each performance was a statement classical music belonged in stadiums, not just conservatories. His recordings of Edelweiss and Bolero became more streamed than many contemporary pop songs. He won Grammy nominations. He performed at the Sydney Opera House and the Vienna State Opera, the very institutions that had once viewed his work with barely concealed disdain. The Johann Strauss Orchestra became the most commercially successful classical ensemble in history. He was selling out performances years in advance. He was generating revenues that rivaled major rock bands. The boy who had felt invisible was now, impossibly, everywhere. But there is always a price for transformation this complete. In 1975, before the orchestra, before the fame, before the world knew his name, André had married Marjorie, a woman of quiet intelligence and genuine affection. She had supported him through the lean years, through the early experiments with theatrical staging, through the dismissal from critics and the doubt from colleagues. They had 2 children together, Mark and Leonard. They built a life that was supposed to be private, supposed to be the anchor that kept André grounded while his public persona expanded into something almost mythological. But fame, even the kind that comes from bringing joy to people, has a way of consuming everything it touches. The schedule became brutal. André was touring constantly, performing in different countries every week, conducting orchestras across continents, recording albums, filming television specials. He would arrive home exhausted in a way that sleep could not repair. Marjorie managed the household, raised the children largely alone, and watched her husband transform into a public property that belonged to audiences in ways he could no longer belong to his own family. The intimacy that had sustained them eroded slowly, then suddenly, then irreparably. In 2009, after 34 years of marriage, André and Marjorie divorced. The announcement shocked people who had built an image of him as the man who celebrated love and romance in every performance. How could the man who made the world waltz, who played l'Avion, Rose, and Romeo and Juliet with such obvious passion, not be able to sustain his own marriage? The pain of the divorce was compounded by something André had never publicly discussed: the realization that his father, Joe Rieu, who had died in 1990, had never lived to see his son's vindication. Joe had passed away when André's orchestra was still considered a curiosity, before the world had decided that joy was worth celebrating. André had spent decades trying to prove to his father that there was another way to honor music. And his father had died still believing his son had betrayed everything. That loss, that irreconcilable timing, became a wound that no amount of applause could ever fully heal. Every standing ovation carried the ghost of his father's absent approval. Additionally, the relentless touring schedule took a physical toll that most people never witnessed. André was performing concert after concert, conducting sometimes multiple shows in a single day during festival seasons. His body began to protest. His shoulders ached from years of violin playing and conducting. His back deteriorated from the constant travel and standing. He underwent multiple surgeries, pushed through injuries that would have sidelined younger musicians, and returned to the stage because canceling concerts felt like a betrayal of the millions of people who had bought tickets. He confessed years later, "The body breaks. The heart breaks. But the music must go on." That was the deal I made when I decided to do this. And yet, something remarkable happened in the aftermath of the divorce and the pain and the physical deterioration. André did not retreat into bitterness or regret. Instead, he deepened his commitment to what he had always believed, that music was a healing force, that joy was a legitimate response to suffering, and that the role of an artist was to give people permission to feel fully. In 2014, at 65 years old, he released Amore, an album dedicated to love in all its forms: romantic love, familial love, the love between performer and audience, the love that sustains us through loss. The album became his most successful work. It was not escapism. It was honesty wrapped in waltz time, pain transformed into beauty, the exact opposite of what his father had taught him was possible. In recent years, André Rieu has become not just a musician, but a cultural institution. He performs to over 500,000 people annually across the globe. His YouTube channel has billions of views. Young people discover him and understand that classical music is not something that happened in the past, but something that is alive and urgent right now. His concerts in venues like Love in Venice and performances of Besame Mucho and Il Silenzio are watched by millions who never step foot in concert halls. He has proven, definitively and undeniably, that the classical establishment was wrong, that accessibility is not a corruption of art, but its ultimate fulfillment, that the measure of music is not how difficult it is to understand, but how deeply it touches the human heart. Today, at 75 years old, André Rieu continues to perform. Every step reminds him of the price he paid for authenticity, the marriage he could not save, the father he could not convince, the years spent fighting against institutions that ultimately became irrelevant. But he also carries something else: the knowledge that his rebellion created permission for millions of people to experience beauty on their own terms. The child who felt invisible inside classical music became the man who made sure no one else would ever have to feel that way again. That is his legacy. Not the records sold or the stadiums filled, but the fundamental reorientation of what music is for. It is not for the elite. It is for anyone brave enough to waltz.